So I think in translation, when Bob says I'm the one known for all those things that he says I'm known for, I'm the local nut job, I think. And so Bob asked me to talk about not the number of people in the watershed, but rather how those people live. And so this term, lifestyle, is what I'm going to talk about and the impact that they have. So I'm going to define a few things for you. I'm going to set the stage for the kind of set of concerns that I have, these kind of challenges. Talk to you about consumerism, what and why we consume, the environmental implications of consumerism, specifically land use issues surrounded with consumerism and the impact on the Bay. Talk a little bit about the Susquehanna River Basin and the work we do up at the Health Institute, and then make one observation for how we could do some relatively simple things that would have a dramatic impact, and they wouldn't have anything to do with controlling the number of people. So what is lifestyle? If you search for this term lifestyle, Alfred Adler used the term style of life in the 1920s, which was really used to describe the dynamics of personality. It was more about psychology than the way the term is used today. The broader sense of the term that we use today dates to the 1960s as a way of living that reflects the values and attitudes of a person or a group, a set of behaviors regarding social relations, consumption, dress, entertainment, recreation, a means of forging a sense of self, creating cultural symbols consistent with personal identity. And I'll talk about why many scholars in this area say Americans really don't have a lot of choice on the way they live. There's a lot of kind of influence for how we live, and we don't really make conscious decisions about that every day. A few other definitions. Consumption is the act or process of consuming. So what is consume? To expend, use up, waste, ravage, destroy, or to purchase goods. Now, interestingly, the use of that term has evolved. In the 1960s, Webster said, yeah, consuming is bad. It's a person or thing that destroys, uses, or wastes something. But by 79, it's just a person who buys something. So it's a good thing, and it's a very important thing in this country, and I'll tell you why. So let me set the stage and tell you a bit about the set of concerns that I have. People here know that the thing that keeps me up at night is a set of converging challenges that I call the perfect storm. Each of these is related to the others. Each of these will make the others more difficult to solve. Each of these is a threat to public health all by itself. So ecosystem and species declines. The Chesapeake is an ecosystem, and it's declining, but we have that kind of problem around the world in virtually every ecosystem on the planet. Climate change, we've all heard about climate change. Still, 50 or 60% of Americans don't quite believe it. The coming era of energy scarcity, what Brad referred to as peak oil, I find that a really fascinating issue, and even fewer people in this country know what that is. Other resource scarcity, so if you think peak oil is a problem, well, we're probably also at peak water in many parts of the country. The ecosystem challenges at the top are going to make those water issues more difficult. There's probably going to be many fewer people in the southwest United States, for example, in 50 years because of the water problems there. Where are those people going to move to? Populations will be on the move aside from the growth of populations in place. We have huge fossil fuel inputs into food production, and so if the fossil fuels themselves become more expensive, what's going to happen to food production? And finally, we have the wrong built environment in this country. Wrong because it's very exacerbating of climate change and also of the Bay, and wrong because it's not prepared for anything other than really cheap and plentiful petroleum. Without cheap and plentiful petroleum, we would not have the built environment in this country that we have. So Brad mentioned this term peak oil. What is peak oil? That term dates to this scary-looking fellow here. Marion King Hubbard was a geophysicist, and in 1949, while working for the Shell Oil Company as a petroleum geologist, he made a startling prediction that the fossil fuel era would be of very short duration. By 1956, he predicted that the United States would achieve its own peak of its own oil production in 1970. So within 14 years, he said the United States, which in 1956 was the largest oil-producing nation in the history of the world, we were producing 7 or 8, almost 9, I think, million barrels of oil a day. He said within 14 years, no matter what we do, our oil production will start to decline. At that time, he was scoffed at. The American Petroleum Institute, where he made his speech, said, don't make that speech. That's wrong. You're going to be laughed at. Nobody's going to believe you. He said it. It got a little bit of press. And then 14 years later, what happened? The United States passed their peak of oil production. In 1970, we passed peak. And no matter what we've done, that changed the world because we could no longer control the price of oil. Once we passed peak, countries that had excess capacity could control the price of oil. So we saw oil price spikes in 73, 79, with small events in the Middle East. And since that time, we have not controlled or had any ability to control the price of oil other than sending our presidents or their relatives to Saudi Arabia and trying to negotiate. Now, Hubbard also said in 1968 that world oil production would peak by 2005. World oil production. So in 1968, 40 years ago, he said that what happened in the United States and what has now been observed to happen in 3/4 of all oil-producing nations on the planet would happen for the entire globe by 2005. And so since that time, okay, so he makes that world prediction in 68. We don't really find much discussion of this until 1997 when Colin Campbell, also a petroleum geologist, and Jean Le Herrera write this book called The Coming Oil Crisis. Richard Heinberg, The Party's Over, Oil War and the Fate of Industrial Societies, lots of books on Hubbard's Peak. Kunstler has written The Long Emergency, which talks about these converging catastrophes of climate change, the wrong built environment, and peak oil. Matthew Simmons, an advisor to the Bush administration and to the Department of Defense and an oil industry investment banker, wrote Twilight in the Desert, The Coming Saudi Oil Shock, and a bunch of other books. And I've read them all, and they're very bad reading. They make you quite depressed because our world is very dependent on this incredible liquid sunlight that was set down hundreds of millions of years ago and that we're using up really quickly. Take a look. It is not cheery reading, and the predictions based on what will happen to economies, what will happen to population, what will happen to food production are quite grim in all of these books. And my wife basically said, you're not reading anymore. So what's the connection of this to the Bay? A sustainable living model is being motivated by those converging challenges. We're eventually going to have to do something about climate change. And no matter what we believe about peak oil, higher energy prices will be here in our lifetimes. These coming challenges will influence patterns of land use, energy use, food production and distribution, and water use. To the extent that we openly discuss and arrive at sustainable ways of living now, the Bay could dramatically benefit. But we could get it wrong, and we have lots of examples in the last 10 years of politicians making the wrong decisions on climate policy and energy policy. And if we get it wrong, it could have dire consequences for the Bay and also for us. So let me talk a little bit about the ways we live and present to you some inconsistent images I propose. The soccer parent who really cares about the environment, who takes his daughter Sarah to the game in his Ford Expedition and the team to McDonald's afterwards. The academic researcher in global climate change, nobody will be mentioned, who flies 8 times per year for international travel. The business executive who gives generously to environmental causes and holds regular fundraising events in her 8,700 square foot home. The teacher who loves the environment and living in the country, who drives 135 miles round trip to work each day and uses pesticides to control the ticks in the backyard. They don't like the country all that much. The environmental organization that builds its LEED Platinum certified building on prime green fields in a rural setting rather than in a city. So what is essential to human survival? What are human needs and what do we need to survive? We need clean and enough water. We need safe and enough food. We need some shelters and some in settlements. We need clean air. We need some clothing depending on where we live. We need some heat depending on where we live. We need stable climate. We also need economic activity. Brad sort of alluded to that. If economies decline, what happens to all this kinds of stuff? Each of those are derived from the environment and ecology, but we're consuming a lot more than that. We don't consume in this country just to survive. We consume for lots of fun, too. So 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer behavior. With 5% of the world's population, we use 25% of the world's oil. The United States is in the top, near the top in both per capita and national greenhouse gas emissions. 2/3 of Americans live in the suburbs, very non-sustainable pattern of living. Americans have unprecedented levels of indebtedness. We spend almost all our money. We work 2 jobs and weekend jobs and have dual income households because we want to buy a lot of stuff. And we spend a lot of that money. So, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in their Consumer Expenditure Survey for 2006-2007 just published a few months ago, the average American consumer unit, which kind of can be thought of as like a household, spends about $50,000 a year. 34% of that is on housing, 18% on transportation, 12% on food. The other things that I have there add up to about 90% of all expenditures. But you know, the first 3 are very dependent on fossil fuel inputs and have a large contribution to the stuff we're talking about today. Over the last 30, 35 years, the average U.S. home size has almost doubled. So at a time when the average U.S. household has declined in size, our living space has increased, and we tend to like lots of private space. We don't go to the movies anymore. We build big theaters in our basement and watch movies by ourselves. We love automobiles in this country. We have an average of 2.3 per household. On average, I believe we have more cars per household in this country than we have drivers in those households. And until just recently, vehicle miles traveled never declined in this country, or a few times it declined, but it's averaging about 10,000 miles per person, and a big part of the American greenhouse gas contribution is from the transportation sector and the fact that in many of our environments we have to drive. There are no options. The voracious U.S. consumer is also responsible for about 20% of the global economy. And China has now passed the United States as the largest greenhouse gas emitter, but about a quarter of that was due to our purchase of inexpensive consumer goods from them that get shipped here. And so there's no disagreement that modern mass consumer society is a fundamental cause of global environmental change, and a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is not a result of us getting richer, but rather is one of the causes of us getting richer, and 70% of our economy depends on these consumer behaviors. When I talk about the voracious U.S. consumer, if you look at the 50-year average savings rate, and savings are important to a nation because we use that to invest. Banks lend it out. That's the way it's supposed to work. We save it, they lend it out, we all grow. The average is about 6 or 8%, but it started declining in the 1990s, and for several times in history, Americans spent more than they earned. They were borrowing to buy more, and some of what we see now with the housing crisis is related to this kind of behavior. What do we consume? We consume water for drinking, cooking, washing, food, energy, materials, land, and we also consume a lot of consumer goods for comfort and recreation, air conditioning, widescreen TVs, international travel, etc. Now, all that consumption has an impact on our environment, and William Rees, if you think I'm grim, you should talk to him. In 1992, he and his graduate student, Mathis Wackernagel, conceptualized the ecologic footprint, which is defined as the amount of biologically productive land and sea area needed to regenerate the resources a human population consumes and to absorb and render harmless the corresponding waste. It's used to estimate the number of Earths we need to support humanity, and Brad alluded to the fact that we will eventually exceed the carrying capacity of the planet. There's plenty of data to suggest we already have done that. Humans have already exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet, and that is why we see degradation in all the measures of environmental health and greenhouse gas emissions, ecosystem health, etc. The environment's being degraded because we already are using too much of it. Now, the carbon footprint is a subset of the ecologic footprint. It's the total set of greenhouse gas emissions in carbon dioxide equivalents for a country, an organization, a person, or a product. But the ecologic footprint basically tells you how much land and water do you need to support every person living that lifestyle. Now, today we're talking about population, but many of us worried about the global environment talk about the twin pillars of the apocalypse. It's not just population growth, it's also consumerism. And here's an example for India and United States. India has a population growth rate of about 1.3%, which is about 16 million people that they're adding to their population per year. The ecologic footprint of the average Indian is about 1 hectare. A hectare is about 2.5 acres. An acre is about the size of a football field. So in terms of water and land area, the average Indian needs about 2.5 football fields to support their lifestyle. And if you add 16 million of them a year, you need 16 million more hectares per year to support those people. And eventually, land is finite. You can believe whatever you want, but land, there's only so much land on the planet. That's how much land and water area they need to survive. In this country, with an annual growth rate of about 1%, most of which comes through immigration, we're adding about 3 million people a year. Our average ecologic footprint in this country is 11 hectares per person. That's about 25 acres. That's about 25 football fields. The average American uses the bioproductive capacity of 25 acres of land and water surface area to support their lifestyles. An impact cumulatively of 33 million hectares per year. So if you want to save the bay and you want to think of a strategy to connect to people, do you tell them to give up their kids first or to live a little bit smaller on the planet? And that's the big discussion. What's the better strategy? Why do we live the way we do? Václav Havel, former Czech president, wrote that citizens of Western democracies are manipulated in ways that are infinitely more subtle and refined than the brutal methods used in post-totalitarian societies. The omnipresent dictatorship of consumption, production, advertising, commerce, and consumer culture. Starkey, who's written a book on microeconomics, said, never, he's sort of corrupting the Winston Churchill phrase, never has so much meant so little to so many. The average lifetime in our household of those things we buy from China, contributing to, gosh, what do we have, about $1 trillion a year trade deficit with China now. The average lifespan of those goods is about 6 to 12 months. And then they end up in solid waste fills. Juliet Schor, faculty at Harvard when she wrote these books, has written a lot on this, mainly as a cultural theorist. Wrote The Overworked American in 1993, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure, The Overspent American, Why We Want What We Don't Need, and Born to Buy, why if you can connect to kids early in their lives and why we market to kids on Saturday morning television all the time, they will become your customer for life. A historical view of competitive spending, mostly from social theory and microeconomics, dates way back. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations wrote that a creditable day laborer would be ashamed to appear in public without a linen shirt. The notion that you're sort of behaving and consuming what you're consuming because of the way you think you're perceived by others. Thorsten Veblen, Norwegian-American economist at University of Chicago, in The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899, wrote that in affluent societies, spending is the vehicle through which people establish social position. The rich spend conspicuously as a personal advertisement. Everyone below watches and tries to emulate those one notch higher. This was the first detailed critique of consumerism, and he argued that happiness was not about relative, was about relative consumption, not about absolute. In this country, with rising levels of consumption over the last 50 years, in survey after survey, Americans are no happier as a result of that increasing wealth. But there are data to suggest that in places where there's large disparities in consumption between rich and poor, that's where people feel it the most. And the people who are in places with a lot of poverty are pretty happy by those increments in wealth and consumption. James Dusenberry, a Harvard economist in the 1940s, was the first one to write about keeping up with the Joneses. It was a critique of suburban life in this country. And he went on to say that economists study how people choose, but sociologists study why they, in fact, have no choice. And so a lot of the ways we behave and what we buy, how much of that is a conscious decision and how much of that is you comparing yourself to your neighbors and being connected to by very sophisticated marketing campaigns that happen all the time in this country. But all these people conclude that above a certain level, the benefits of increased consumerism only accrue to capitalists, to the people making all this stuff. We don't get any happier. The environment suffers. The only people who benefit are the people who can make profit from it. So here we're talking about the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which consists of 6 states in the District of Columbia. We see on the left development pressure, high, moderate for red and orange, and you can see where a lot of that population growth and development is expected to occur. We see Maryland in this area here, DC and Baltimore. On the right, we see the actual populations, and you can see where most of the people in the watershed live by those populations. But what's clear is that in the past 60 years, the population of the watershed has about doubled from 8.4 to about almost 17 million people in 2008. And Brad talked a bit about this. This diagram and this text is from the Maryland Commission on Climate Change's Climate Action Plan that came out a couple of years ago. And this shows what Brad was referring to, how what we build on land eventually gets into the bay, contributes to this dead zone, and degradation of the ecosystem that way. But the Maryland Climate Change Commission also said that they expect climate change to have big impacts on the ecosystem. Our restoration goals are likely going to be more difficult to achieve. The living resources in the bay will change in species composition and abundance, they are predicting with climate change. And increasing ocean acidity will also influence shellfish production. So it's not just about the number of people, because it's this notion of converging catastrophes and the notion that energy issues and climate issues are going to make everything we're talking about regarding the bay more complicated. This figure of development patterns in 2030 projected by the United States Climate Change Science Panel, which is now the Global Change Research Panel. But in 2006, they wrote in here, so you see Washington and Baltimore is here, Frederick's that blip out there, and this is Northern Virginia here. But you can see with the probability of development, the current extensive development is the darkest, and then they have increasing probabilities of additional development. And there's great expectation that we're going to continue to use land very rapidly in these areas, and if we do it the way we've been doing it, where land use growth outstrips population growth, it will have a big impact, a big negative impact on the bay. Now, the American approach to land use is unique on the planet. I really like this slide. This compares the built-up areas of Atlanta and Barcelona compared on the same scale. So in 1990, Barcelona and Atlanta both had about 2.5 to 3 million people, but in Atlanta, those 2.5 million people lived on 4,300 square kilometers, and in Barcelona, their people lived on 162 square kilometers. Now, there's reasons Barcelona looks like this, historical and some geographic kinds of limitations. There's no limitations, there's no mountain ranges, no big oceans near Atlanta. They can spread as much as they want. But this is one of the most sprawling places in the country, with an average of 584 persons per square kilometer. But most of the United States is like this. Our cities are less dense than European cities, and our suburbs are a disaster compared to the way people in other countries live. And this has an impact on land use, and this has an impact to what gets in the bay. So these kinds of loop and lollipop developments, which we see all over this country, in public health, we see increasing connections of this way of living to social capital. There's growing recognition that this kind of living is socially isolating. It's not walkable. It may be contributing to the obesity and diabetes epidemics, and it uses a lot of resources. People who live in places like this use more water, drive more, use more gasoline, use more energy, emit more greenhouse gases than anybody else. And what's also interesting about this is that these people don't like each other. Every single one of those houses has a fence, right? Has a fence. They don't like each other. So what we're doing is we're privatizing our spaces. We don't have good public spaces in this country, and we don't hang out in those public spaces and talk to each other. We have big private spaces. We wall ourselves off from our neighbors, and if little Johnny wants to play with little Sarah, he can't just walk across. His mother's going to have to drive him all the way around, and then he'll call her up and say, Mom, I'm ready to come home. And little Johnny doesn't ever walk. He gets driven everywhere. So why do our places look like this? They look like this because they were not designed for us. They were not designed for people. They were designed for our cars. This kind of low-density, single-use, low-destination accessibility design with streets designed for cars with little street detail, high speeds and volumes, wide avenues. They're not gridded. They're not safe to walk. And mainly in places where public transit is not effective is what we ended up with. Now, this way of building exists only because gasoline has been cheaper than water in this country almost forever. You don't have a built environment that looks like that unless you have cheap and plentiful oil. If you believe what Hubbard and the vast majority of petroleum geologists says, more expensive oil is on the way. So what happens to places like that when gasoline is $10 a gallon? Do they look like that? Do people continue to live in York, Pennsylvania, and work in Baltimore? I don't think so, and there's actually data on that. The other problem with our places is they are divorced from the bioregions in which they are located for food, water, and energy. What does that mean? Because we have cheap energy, we get our energy, a lot of our energy at great distances. We get it from the Middle East. We get it from mountain ranges in West Virginia. Californians get their water from the Colorado Rockies. Our food travels thousands of miles on average to get to us. And we have no idea what goes into our food production and how it's done. The other problem in this country is that we have a lot of sprawl around small towns and cities, such that the federal government created a new category called micropolitan areas. Micropolitan areas are areas in which the core city has a population of 10 to 50,000 people. And in this country, we have about 10% of our population who live in about 580 micropolitan regions like that. And we are using prime farmlands for subdivisions in those places. So here's the Maryland-Pennsylvania state line. Here's southern Pennsylvania. This shows metro and non-metro counties in Pennsylvania, and the blue shows micropolitan counties. And so these are places where the core city is between 10 and 50,000, and we see a lot of this kind of development in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so this part of southern Pennsylvania is 40 miles from Baltimore and 20 miles from York, and you see this kinds of loop and lollipop development all through here. It's what real estate agents say is you drive to qualify. You go far enough away, you can buy the 3,000 square foot house that you'd like to buy, but then you have to drive 50 miles to go to work. In Pennsylvania, micropolitan growth has outpaced metropolitan and non-core growth over the past 20 years, and we have lots of this kinds of stuff going on in this country. So I like to say that in this country what we do is we convert cabbages into cabbages. Cabbages grown on the farm, but when the farmer sells his land to the developer in a non-walkable place, we increase the risk for coronary artery bypass grafts. So we convert cabbages into cabbages. The other problem with the way we're building has to do with impervious surfaces in the watershed. Impervious surfaces inhibit infiltration of rainfall into the soils. They lead directly to problems with water quality and quantity. And we see impervious surfaces across and growth in those surfaces. Talk a bit about the Susquehanna River Basin. 50% of the fresh water flowing into the Chesapeake is from the Susquehanna. And so we see this in Pennsylvania. And in this area of Pennsylvania, humans have had a large impact on the land. There are abandoned coal mines and acid mine drainage, agriculture, animal feeding operations, low-density land use development, and Marcellus shale development. And up there, there's also the Geisinger Health System, where we here and them developed the Joint Environmental Health Institute. And we see that Geisinger has 41 clinics and 4 hospitals across a good part of the watershed. And we're doing a lot of environmental epidemiologic research that if we can't convince people to live in a different way for the sake of the environment, maybe they'll do it for the sake of public health. And so a lot of our environmental epidemiology knows what the environmental goals should be, but are trying to do it to convince people based on public health outcomes. So we have studies going on agricultural practices and CAFOs and community-acquired methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, land use and transportation, and the impact of sprawl on obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, and the impact of the large number of abandoned mines up there on human health as well. This shows swine concentrated animal feeding operations in Pennsylvania. And you see throughout the watershed, the Susquehanna River is going up through here. And we have lots of swine CAFOs. There's also probably an equal number of slightly smaller facilities called concentrated animal operations scattered throughout here as well. This slide shows that land use growth has dramatically exceeded population growth over the last couple decades in Pennsylvania. So at a time when urban land use, at a time when population in this area was growing maybe 4 to 5% on average, land use growth was going up 50%, and population densities were declining across this area. So this shows places where the population density decline exceeded 25%. So these places are sprawling, and in sprawling areas, more stuff's going to roll off the land and get into the water. In Pennsylvania, there's also a big problem with abandoned mine lands. They have 5,000 abandoned coal mines that's contributing to about 4,500 miles of acid mine drainage affected streams throughout the state here. We're doing studies on those. Abandoned mine lands leave real scars on the landscape. With surface mines next to where people live, you can see the connection to the water. All sorts of nasty stuff runs off of there into water. High walls, and here's acid mine drainage. Throughout Pennsylvania, you find orange streams because the iron sulfate that's deposited in them from acid mine drainage precipitates as this orange precipitate, and nothing can live in a place like that. So just to finish up, make a single observation about the alternative to talking about population. And on the left is how we currently live in these loop and lollipop developments of low density, which are very disruptive to ecosystems. And most of us know that agriculture happens far away, but we get our food at the grocery store and don't worry too much about how it happens. But we could live in a different way. We could put those 9 housing units in one place. We could preserve the ecosystem, which would be very good for the bay, allow a few other species to hang out with us, and connect people to where they get their food. And this would have a lot of different benefits. And so, do you want to talk to people about not having kids, or do you want to talk to people about the impact that they have on the land? So there are multiple benefits of changes in urban form. If we did this, we would reduce all resource use, we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, we would improve chronic diseases because these kinds of walkable places are good for risk of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. We would decrease regional air and water pollution. We would decrease the tax burden of low-density development on municipalities who must pay for the infrastructure in these low-density places. We would probably improve the health of our inner cities, and we would decrease social isolation and increase social capital, as Putnam has written about in Bowling Alone. So to finish, the Earth's resources are finite. There's no debate about that. The question is, can we continue to live the way we live on a finite planet? Americans don't think so. In 1995, 89% of Americans thought that buying and consuming was the American way. So do you want to talk to people about what they consume, or do you want to talk to them about their number of kids? I think it's a strategic decision that we have to think about. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Brian. We are going to take a break in a few minutes to sample some locally produced carbon impact healthy food. But before we do that, let's have a couple of questions for Brian.
Don't you think that we should all be rooting very quickly for a major decline in oil in order to change our crazy lifestyles?
Well, I understand where that question comes from, but if it happened quickly, I think it'd be incredibly economically disruptive. And I don't think we'd be happy. I do think we should put a big tax on gasoline. It would have many, many impacts on urban form. We would stop sending money to people who hate us, and it would do a lot for greenhouse gas emissions. But if this geologic limitation of oil production is manifested in rapid declines and really rapid increases in the price of oil, the kinds of recessions that we're going through now will become the norm. There's all sorts of data that every oil price spike in history was followed by recession. And the oil price spike in July of 2008, which is the largest oil price spike in history, was followed by the largest recession in history. Many economists are starting to link the two.
Brian, just an observation. You may have some thoughts on it. In one of those many books on peak oil, I recall somebody said, you know, peak oil per capita actually was pretty clearly reached in the 70s, and he thought that might ultimately, as more people bid for their share, have as much impact as peak oil itself.
I think that's right. Most of the analysis that looks at sort of world economic growth finds that world economic growth correlates with total energy inputs, not per capita energy inputs. And most of, and Brad sort of alluded to this too, we do all what we do in this country assuming we will have economic growth forever. Not per capita, just total increase in our economy. So I actually think that it's a bigger issue in terms of total production, not per capita production.
Brian, I'm perplexed at why you've presented changing lifestyle and stabilizing population. I think it's better to talk about stabilizing population than controlling it. This is a streetwise kind of thing. Why do you present them as alternatives and not complementary to one another?
Listen, I agree that the problems I've talked about today are related to both of those. Strategically, I actually feel it's a bit of an ethical and moral issue. Whether we have a smaller impact in the way we live or we talk to people about their number of children. I just feel like when we're living this kind of profligately, we should do that first. I'm not saying we shouldn't do the other, but I actually think this is the moral issue that needs to be addressed first. Just a personal opinion. In a sense, in talking to my neighbors and colleagues all over the place, what can you talk to people about? In these issues, the issue that always comes up is the notion of sacrifice. You're getting me to give up stuff that I like to do. You want me to stop eating meat? You want me to stop driving my big SUV? You want me to live in a smaller house, closer to the city, and have less children? I don't think I like you. and that's just the way it goes. And they sort of tune you off. And to me, it's just strategic. If the messaging on population growth and population control was easier to achieve, I'd say we should do that. My sense is it's easier to talk about how we live than our number of children.
I don't think it's been approached in the right way. Population stabilization, not control. But that's it.
Yes, go ahead.
But in fact, over the last 50 years, Americans and the rest of the world in general have shown an inclination to reduce their fertility. At the same time, they're increasing their per capita consumption. So I don't understand what you just said. In other words, people show they're willing to reduce the fertility, even when we, except in China, don't have a government policy that's demanding it. But they have shown no information whatsoever to reduce these other consumptive lifestyle measures you're talking about.
But I think there's a very easy way to achieve that. A tax on gasoline would rapidly change urban form. And all this other stuff follows that. It's much more complicated to get people to control the number of kids. The other issue is that most of our population growth, Stan's going to talk about this, but most of the population growth in this country is immigration. And so, you want to talk about that? Okay, let's talk about it.
Go ahead.
I really enjoyed your presentation, a lot of what you had to say. One comment, I wouldn't say that, one thing I disagreed with, when you said that gas is cheaper than water. At $1 a thousand gallons, it too has a problem, and for the people who can afford it,
There's a lot of infrastructure and water measures and environmental measures that could be paid for if we paid more for water. So I just put that out there.
Fair enough.
Final question before the break.
I'm thinking about the suburban sprawl issue. And I know there's a lot of comparisons between, should I buy a new Prius or just continue to drive my old Camry, which is better for the environment. So it's clear that you don't want more suburban sprawl, but what do you do with that that's already there? I mean, do we clear it all and put in farmland? Like, what is sort of the environmental impact and cost of getting rid of all of that?
Yeah, so, as you read about these issues, you learn about landscape architects, urban planners, many of whom care deeply about all these same issues. They're environmentalists. They're thinking a lot about this stuff. Ellen Dunham-Jones at Georgia Institute of Technology has written a book called Retrofitting Suburbia. And basically, the observation was made, if you look at the development of Washington, D.C. over the last maybe let's say 50 years, most of the development 50 years ago in Washington, D.C. was with edge cities. The development was where highways came together. But in the last decade or so, you're seeing development around where the transit is. And so the problem with transit is you have to have about 15 housing units per acre to make the transit economically viable. So what Ellen Dunham-Jones is saying is take your malls, build some housing, and put a train track out there, and that's one solution. It's a huge project. Don't forget, 65% of Americans live in those places. It's going to be very expensive, but it's going to happen no matter what we do because higher energy prices are coming. And if we don't do it carefully, the other thing you see in this literature is that many people predict that the next slums will be the suburbs. They'll be abandoned. Whether you believe that or not, you can take a look.
Thank you, Brian.